In the 17th century, the island at the mouth of the Hudson changed like a frontier wind. First, there was a modest Dutch trading post called New Amsterdam, then a coveted foothold for rival empires. Wooden houses, muddy lanes, and a stout little fort framed its early life. When English ships appeared offshore, the colony passed to English control without a battle. Dutch speech gave way to a new authority and a new name. By the end of the century, the settlement was restless and growing, a crossroads of ambition on the edge of a vast continent. This is New York in the 1600s. In 1609, Henry Hudson's Landing marked the first European foothold along the river that would bear his name. His crew stepped onto a wooded tidal shore alive with Lenape trade routes, a quiet moment that soon attracted merchants, settlers, and competing empires. A modest arrival, uncertain and unadorned, but it opened the door to everything that followed. In 1626, Dutch officials secured Manhattan from the Lenape in an exchange later valued at 24 guilders of trade goods. The deal was quiet, practical, and deeply misunderstood across cultures, yet it gave the Dutch a foothold they quickly fortified. In the early days of New Amsterdam, building the settlement meant relentless, back-breaking labor. Settlers felled thick Manhattan forests with hand axes, dragging heavy logs through mud to raise homes, palisades, and warehouses. Wood smoke, sweat, and the crack of splitting timber filled the air as the small colony carved itself out of wilderness, one beam, one plank, one hard-earned day at a time. In 1626, Fort Amsterdam rose at the southern tip of Manhattan, a rough palisade of timber and earth guarding the young Dutch colony. From its ramparts, soldiers watched over the harbors, the warehouses of the West India Company, and the fragile beginnings of New Amsterdam.
It was the colony's shield and its statement of intent, a foothold meant to last. In 1644, Dutch leaders and native nations forged a series of fragile treaties meant to quiet years of bloodshed. Around council fires and makeshift tables, envoys traded promises and uneasy concessions. The agreements brought a brief peace, less trust than exhaustion, yet they allowed New Amsterdam to breathe and rebuild. In 1655, enslaved Africans were brought into New Amsterdam in growing numbers, their forced labor woven into the colony's docks, farms, and households. Sold as property by the Dutch West India Company, they lived under harsh rules and constant supervision. It was a quiet but brutal turning point, bondage becoming a fixed part of the city's early economy. Inside a New Amsterdam home in the mid-17th century, life unfolded in a single, crowded room warmed by a brick hearth. Light filtered through small leaded windows onto rough wooden tables, wool blankets, and pottery dishes stacked neatly on shelves. Families rose early to the smell of porridge and the scrape of wooden stools. Children helped grind grain or fetch water, while adults tended chores, mending nets, cutting firewood, and preparing salted meats for winter. The air carried a mix of wood smoke, drying herbs, and the damp scent of river winds slipping through the cracks. Evenings in the settlement were calm yet busy, candles flickering low, while people told stories, whispered prayers, and laid out tools for the next day's work. Life was modest, disciplined, and communal. Every chore, cooking, sewing, sweeping, tending animals, kept a steady rhythm that held the fragile community together. In 1664, English warships drifted into the harbor, their guns aimed at the fort that still bore the Dutch lion. Outnumbered and divided, New Amsterdam offered little resistance. The colonists, weary of conflict, chose a quiet surrender, and the city passed into English hands, receiving the new name, New York. No shot was fired, yet the future shifted in an instant. 3 years later, the Treaty of Breda formally confirmed what force had begun. The Dutch ceded New Netherland to England in exchange for distant holdings in Suriname, and New York became English territory, ending Dutch hopes of reclaiming the colony. Diplomatic paperwork solidified the city's new laws, loyalties, and direction. In 1673, Dutch ships entered the harbour and seized the city, renaming it New Orange and hoisting the old banners for a restless year. However, diplomacy moved faster than cannons. By the next treaty, the colony was returned to England, and New Orange again became New York. The episode was brief, a flicker of the old Dutch world, before the English future closed around it. By 1679, the former Dutch Status Building served as New York's City Hall, a relic of New Amsterdam, now operating under English rule. Merchants, magistrates, and clerks moved through its cramped rooms, settling disputes and recording the business of a growing port. The structure stood as a reminder of the city's Dutch past, still useful and central as New York forged its new identity. Around 1680, the town expanded rapidly under English governance. The population topped 4,000. Brick houses rose along the streets, and the harbour grew busier with Atlantic trade. At the same time, the enslaved population increased sharply, shaping the colony's labour force and daily life. By that time, New York's Great Dock stretched into the East River, becoming the colony's busiest gateway. Merchants, sailors, and labourers crowded its planks, unloading barrels of sugar, furs, and tobacco, while new ships arrived from the Atlantic. The dock's constant creak and roar signaled the city's growing ambitions, a small port quickly becoming a vital link in the empire's trade network. The homes of New York still showed strong Dutch influence: steep gables, brick facades, and thick wooden beams. Though years of English rule had introduced sash windows and broader chimneys, the streets retained their Dutch layout and style. The city, like its people, remained a blend in transition. An old defensive wall still marked the northern edge of the settlement. Running along what would become Wall Street, its timber ramparts aged but remained intact. Where the wall met the East River stood the Watergate, a modest fortified passage where carts, travelers, and river goods entered the town under watchful guard. In the year 1689, New York's citizen militia, known as the Train Band, assembled amid the unrest that followed the Glorious Revolution. Merchants, artisans, and laborers drilled together on the commons, a mixed company of Dutch, English, and colonial-born men whose loyalties were in flux. In the turmoil, many officers signed a declaration supporting Jacob Lair and rejecting the old royal appointees. But the rebellion was short-lived. After a brief moment of resolve, the militia returned to royal authority before the year ended. At that time, the colony was tense and unsettled. News from England spoke of kings rising and falling, leaving New Yorkers unsure whose rule truly held sway. Debates rang out in taverns, soldiers continued their drills on the commons, and ordinary residents watched the harbor for ships that might bring new orders or further upheaval. The city lived in a state of uneasy waiting, caught between rumor, uncertainty, and the shifting tide of empire. By the year 1699, Pearl Street had become one of the city's busiest thoroughfares, winding along the old shoreline. Traders, craftsmen, and sailors crowded its wooden shops, and the air was filled with the scent of tar, spices, and river breezes, a reminder of how close the settlement lived to the sea that sustained it. Fast forward to 1893, when New York policemen patrolled the city roaring with industry and crowded streets. Dressed in dark blue wool with brass buttons, they walked fixed beats through saloons, tenements, and gaslit avenues, trying to maintain order in a metropolis growing faster than the law could keep pace. Their presence was steady but strained, caught between rising crime, political pressure, and the restless energy of the Gilded Age.